So good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I would like to begin my welcome today by acknowledging that here in New York City, where I'm located, we are today on, where I'm located today, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wapinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. And Manhattan remains the home of Indigenous peoples from across these lands and waters. My name is Kirstine Schirrer. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as white. I was born and raised in Denmark in the northern part of the country in a small city called Aalborg. I am a first-generation settler in the so-called United States, where I have lived for the last 12 years. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University, and I am the organizer of the Roundtable event today and on Wednesday. Today, I am wearing a green-colored shirt, and I have shoulder-length dark blonde hair, and in my background, there is a bookshelf. This land acknowledgement raises new questions about the land back imperative, about settler and non-Indigenous allyship and performativity. These questions are not easily answered, and I would like to nevertheless encourage everyone, especially people calling in from Northern Europe, to learn about whose lands you are on, and the histories of how this land was made into property that you're in a relationship with in one way or the other today. Thank you also, Jasmine Kellicay, for offering your input on this part of my introduction. So I will be on the mic for a few more minutes, and I'll then introduce and pass it on to Dr. Monica Miller, who will share a few remarks. I'll then come back and introduce Elizabeth Löwe Hunter, who will be moderating today's panel, and we will be in Elizabeth's hands for the full session before you'll see me again back here just before 12 p.m. First of all, thank you to the almost 350 people in the audience that have registered for this event. Thank you also to Dr. Tammy Navarro, who unfortunately couldn't be with us this week, and to Dr. Monica Miller, who we will hear from later. Both Dr. Navarro and Dr. Miller have supported this project without hesitation since its inception and through its various instantiations. I would also like to extend a warm thanks to the Department of Anthropology and Dr. Catherine Fennell at Columbia University, who has backed my proposal since its early days. A special thank you also for the generous funding from our numerous sponsors. Hang in there, because there are a few. So our sponsors include at Columbia University, the Department of Anthropology, and the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy, the Center for the Study on Ethnicity and Race, and the Society of Fellows, the Haven Center of the Humanities. At Barnard College, thank you to our sponsors that include the Digital Humanities Center, the Center for Research on Women, and Africana Studies. And finally, thank you to the American Scandinavian Foundation for their public project grant. At the Society of Fellows, events happen because of Keishang and Lindsay Schramm. Thank you both, as always, for all that you do. And a lot has been going on behind the scenes for months in getting all of this together. Last but not least, a special thank you to Elizabeth Löwe Hunter and Jasmine Kellicay for accepting the invitation to moderate these roundtables. Mind you that it is now 7 a.m. on the West Coast, where they are both calling in from. Finally, thank you very much to the speakers for kindly accepting my invitation for you to speak here today. It means the world. We will hear much from you soon. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Monica Miller, who has agreed to offer opening remarks for us today. Dr. Miller is Anne Whitney Olin Professor of English and Africana Studies and the Dean of Faculty Diversity and Development at Barnard College, which is right on the other side of the street from Columbia. Dr. Miller specializes in African American and American literature and cultural studies and is the author of the book Slaves to Fashion, Black Dandyism and the Styling of Black Diasporic Identity. She's currently at work on a new project, Blackness, Swedish Style, Figuring Blackness in a Place Without Race, which is a multi-genre investigation of multiculturalism, integration, and Afro-Swedishness in relation to Black European studies and theories of diaspora and diasporic belonging. It is an honor to welcome you here today, Dr. Miller. Please take the Zoom floor.
Thank you to Anna, and welcome everyone to Columbia and New York City virtually. I'm delighted to see old and new friends and colleagues this morning. I'm not going to take a lot of time because I'm really eager for this conversation, but I will take just a few minutes to talk about how I will be listening to this conversation and what I'm hoping to learn. I'm going into this conversation thinking about three things primarily. One, definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. Yes, but language is, to really do a mashup of Black feminist quotation, a vexy thing. Many of you will recognize the first phrase about definition from Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. The second, a vexy thing, is the title of a recent book on Black feminist liberation by Imani Perry. Morrison's phrase is said initially as a warning to indicate a seemingly fixed relation between language and ontology, words and being. But as Morrison also teaches us, and Perry explains, language is also a vexy thing, consternating, changeable, slippery, and nuanced. Definitions are changeable according to context, time, and space. I'll be listening today and Wednesday to understand the difficulty, necessity, and controversy of invoking and deploying the key phrases that will animate these talks: settler colonialism, racial capitalism, Indigenous sovereignties, governance of difference, and the Nordics. As you will surely hear today, these concepts are not routinely used to describe social, cultural, and political realities of the indigenous or racialized in Scandinavia. When these theoretical frameworks are invoked along with their cousin, critical race theory, they are deemed foreign, not applicable or translatable metaphorically or actually to Northern Europe. So today, I will be listening for how we might define and redefine these concepts in and for a Nordic context, and what this translation can teach us about local and more global forms of resistance. Two, related to this, I will be thinking about the fact that while there are sometimes exceptions to the rule, exceptionalism as a steady state does not actually exist. During the next 2 days, I will be listening for the many ways in which our speakers will not only challenge ideas about Nordic exceptionalism, which include historically inaccurate and false ideas about colorblindness, racial or white innocence, the lack of internal and external colonial or imperial histories, benign histories of immigration, and false accounts of functioning modern multicultural statehood. But I'll also be listening for the challenge, or for our panelists to challenge and help us move beyond the need to have this conversation, continually beginning at step one in the first place. In my own work, I often insist, contrary to deeply held convictions of exceptionalism, that Sweden has been and is currently a part of a deeply unequal world and shares with nearly all the other European countries histories implicated in both settler colonialism and racial capitalism. The Nordics pretend to be places in which there is racism without racists. Some have difficulty understanding, for example, how and why a presence of Blackness and anti-Blackness can and does predate a sizable presence of people of African descent in Nordic countries. In 2021, the New York Times published an article that spoke of French President Emmanuel Macron's fear of, and this is from the article, certain social science theories entirely imported from the United States, of the contamination of public debate about race, gender, and post-colonialism by the out-of-control woke leftism of American campuses. In these next few days, I will be listening for how politicians and intellectuals in Stockholm, Oslo, Copenhagen, and Helsinki might be thinking through similar challenges from groups like this one, assembled here today, and how, depending on their politics and theoretical orientations, these leaders might meaningfully address, and this is from the article again, a younger, more diverse guard that considers these theories as tools to understanding the willful blind spots of an increasingly diverse nations that still recoil at the mention of race, have yet to come to terms with its colonial past, and often wave away the concerns of minorities as identity politics. This reckoning will include the fact that increasingly gatherings like this one here today often now have scholars who are not, from the perspective of the old guard, just the objects we speak of, but they're also now the subjects who are talking. Thirdly, and finally, I will be listening for how scholarship and activism around the topics of settler colonialism and racial capitalism can speak to each other with nuance and in solidarity. In our current pandemic world, we see both the necessity for and the difficulty of coalition. Being a community and working together across lines of race, ethnicity, religion, and nation is necessary and still a challenge, even with Zoom. The difficulty of coalition building has a specific history in Nordic social democracies, and say, for example, the ways in which immigrant and racial others are segregated from the larger population in terms of housing and work, but also separated from each other via the ways in which some governments support or have supported and resourced community organization along specific ethnic lines. I will be listening for what scholarship and activism from these two vantage points can say to each other and how we might think of them in solidarity without erasing specific histories and contexts as well as social realities. Many thanks to everyone for partaking in this conversation. I am listening and you have my full attention. So I'll hand it over to Elizabeth.
I'll just jump in before Elizabeth. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for opening up this space today with your thoughtful words and for helping us try and do the challenging work of thinking about these terms and listening within a shared conjunction. I will soon now pass it over to Elizabeth Löwe Hunter, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, with an emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality studies. Hunter examines the conditions for subjectivity, belonging, and material realities among racially minoritized people in Denmark, specifically the African diasporas. Elizabeth's work has been published in the peer-reviewed journal Periscope and has a large Scandinavian readership on the open access platform Medium. Elizabeth is frequently invited to give talks with activists and scholars in local and regional anti-racist and feminist communities, and we're very happy to have you here today. Elizabeth, please take the floor. I'll hand over the mic to you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Good morning, everybody. And thank you also, Dr. Miller, for your introduction and for your contextualization. I really appreciate that. So I will also begin by just contextualizing myself a bit. So I am at UC Berkeley at the moment and currently living in Oakland. So I do want to share also a land acknowledgement that is formulated by UC Berkeley's Native American Student Development in collaboration with the Muwekma Ohlone tribe here in the Bay Area. We recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the historic and sovereign Rauna band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Rauna band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold the University of California, Berkeley more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. And so this was written by the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and the UC Berkeley Native American Student Development here. And so I also want to supplement this for other people who might be guests on this land, as I am, by just sharing the knowledge of the Sogoreté Land Trust, which is a great supplement to this acknowledgement. Sogoreté Land Trust, as you can see if you look at their website, they write they are an urban Indigenous women-led land trust based in the San Francisco Bay Area that facilitates the return of Indigenous land to Indigenous peoples. And so this is a great opportunity to for us to educate ourselves, and also a very easy way to redistribute some funds in a very easy system for all economic scales. And so I was very excited to hear about this panel with these specific topics, these frames, as Monica already introduced. It was very rare. I thought I had not seen those connections between these frameworks of indigenous sovereignty and racial capitalism and the Nordics together. And so on the one hand, I'm very excited. On the other hand, I also think, how come we can only have these conversations through the US or the US institutions or US scholars, right? So it's a bittersweet opportunity. It's wonderful that we can have these conversations. And I also do notice that, that there's often this link through the US, so that we can actually gain access to or be in conversation through these type of radical frameworks. And I mean radical here just in the simple definition that Angela Davis has also reminded us. It means addressing issues at their roots, right? So both of these frameworks really offers a deep historicization and contextualization of the power dynamics that we are actually trying to study. So I am excited about that. And I am also sometimes frustrated that we have to then, as people from the Nordic context, we also have to translate ourselves. So what's actually at stake there, what is gained, but also what is lost when we do have to have these conversations, it seems, transnationally, but also through literal translation, through language, but particularly also conceptually, as Monica Miller also said, not everything is directly translatable. So I do want to contextualize that in that way. Yes. Yes, and so to begin with, I really don't want to take up too much space and time here. I also do want to contextualize myself as a person. So I'm not indigenous to the lands that I sit on here. I'm also not indigenous to Denmark, where I'm born and raised there, but I cannot be considered really an indigenous person there. So my personal relationship to land is very much one of formal citizenship that I do have, and it does bring a lot of privilege in this current system. But the relationships to land that I'm very interested in hearing more about from these particular Nordic contexts is actually something that is very far from my own relationship. My relationship to land is one of diaspora, so it's very much one of being cut off from knowledge, from history about where that land might be. And the land where I'm born and raised, well, I can never fully claim that, as I will always be considered other and suggested that I belong to another place, right? So I speak from a position of more so landlessness, if you will, while obviously recognizing the citizenship status that gives a lot of material security as far as possible, while also a Black person. So to start this, maybe a little bit ahead of time, but I do really want to give forward the words to the panelist guests today. So I really want to hold sort of two frames as something that I hope that we could speak within. So one is this transnational situation that I already mentioned, the conditions for us to produce knowledge around our own conditions, around our relationships with each other, around relationships within the to the nation states and the structures of power that we are situated within. So the intellectual transnationalism in one sense, and then at the other hand also, I would love to bring forward when we talk about the substance and when we are listening to all of your work, I really want to invite you to contextualize yourselves so that we can get all of the beautiful nuances of who you are, who your peoples are, but also especially to really emphasize the pretty great differences across those contexts that we're speaking from here. So the types of nation states, the types of colonial projects, it's quite different to learn about, for me as a guest, to learn about settler colonialism, for example, in a settler colonial state, and what does that mean actually to learn about or to theorize settler colonialism in a place such as Denmark, for example, that has this geographical separation from the territories that it has and is in colonial relationships with, right? So I really want to hold that alongside with also just the sizes of these places, the American contexts, which are continents, the Scandinavian and Nordic contexts, which are quite different and smaller with a different history, right? They're not just settler colonial. There are many different projects going on there at the same time. So I would love to hear what that actually does for the conversations that we can have. Are we speaking about the same things, or at least the importance of really defining what terms mean for us, or if we have terms that might be unknown to each other, to take some time with that. And then also, again, to recognize that I have not seen these topics brought up in a Nordic context, and maybe they are being brought up and I just don't know, but that just still means that there's some disconnect, because those of us working across the same topics, well, we should be in conversation. So if these conversations already happen in a only Nordic context, well, what are the disconnects then? So yeah, so with those things in mind, I am pleased and humble also to be the moderator of this panel, very much so as a guest, and I will do that as carefully as possible. So I do want to hand over the mic to, well, I do want to introduce everybody first, and then I will hand over the mic to Audra Simpson. Just a second. All right. So Audra Simpson is a political anthropologist whose work is focused on contextualizing the force and consequences of governance through time, space, and bodies. Her research and writing is rooted within Indigenous polities in the US and Canada and crosses the fields of anthropology, Indigenous studies, American and Canadian studies, gender and sexuality studies, as well as politics. Her book, Mohawk Interrupts: Political Life Across the Borders of Settler States, won the Sharon Stevens Prize, the Best First Book Award, as well as the Laura Romero Award. In 2010, she won the School of General Studies Excellence in Teaching Award. Mia Sialuk is a traditional Inuit tattoo artist, an independent researcher in Inuit culture and religion, and a teacher and lecturer. In 2010, she founded the tattoo and research project Inuit Tattoo Traditions that covers the Inuit territories in Greenland, Canada, and Alaska. In her research, Maya Sialuk focuses on cultural preservation and research ethics, as well as ethical issues surrounding the use of cultural heritage among settlers and natives. Ellen Marie Jensen is an associate professor at Sámi allaskuvla, where she teaches in the Sámi Pathfinder program and in journalism and media studies. She holds a PhD in humanities and social sciences, in literature and cultural studies concentration, as well as a master in Indigenous studies and a master in English literature. As a child of a North Sámi from the Norwegian side of Sápmi and an Anglo-American settler from the Midwest, Jensen's scholarship largely addresses transatlantic migration processes from Indigenous and gendered perspectives. She is currently working on 2 volumes based on her PhD study on narratives of early 20th century Sámi migrant women. And Rauna Kuokkanen is a research professor of Arctic Indigenous Studies at the University of Lapland, adjunct professor at the University of Toronto, and a 2021 to 2022 Fulbright Arctic Initiative Fellow. Her most recent book is the award-winning Restructuring Relations, Indigenous Self-Determination, Governance, and Gender, an Indigenous feminist investigation of Indigenous self-determination, governance, and gender regimes in Indigenous political institutions. Professor Kuokkanen has recently published on the Truth and Reconciliation Process in Finland and Nordic settler colonialism. She's from Utsjoki, I'm sorry about the pronunciation, in Sápmi, and previously lived in Canada for nearly 20 years. So with that said, I want to hand over the mic and attention to Audra Simpson.
Thanks so much for that, Elizabeth, and greetings to all of you. I am the North Americanist here, and I will be addressing the question of sovereignty in North America. So I'm really excited to learn about the ways in which these terms are migrating and moving throughout the Nordics. We heard over and over again during the resistance to the extension of the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016 that, quote, Indigenous sovereignty protects the land and water. This was pervasive, and it was also mobilizational, and it was also coming from another place. This was proclaimed as well in earlier actions north of the border during Idle No More. The Idle No More demonstrations happened in 2012, demonstrations and actions that were as well in response to dangers posed to land. DAPL was in its moment, in its moments of active opposition, a pipeline that was built through lands, and notice the tensing of this is complicated because I'm denoting a resistance to something that happened, was built through lands that were themselves atop an aquifer and the largest water table possibly in the world. And Indigenous sovereignty, legal jurisdiction over territory, was secured by the Lakota through treaties, hallmarks of sovereignty that were signed by the Lakota and the Americans in 1851 and 1868. All defined the boundaries of their territory and were being abrogated by the state of South Dakota, by the US, and by the private transnational corporation that sought to extend this pipeline through Lakota territories in order to route it south and then distribute it to sites overseas. Indigenous sovereignty in this form of a legal protected right to jurisdiction over territory, secured through historic agreements, in this case, blatantly protects land and water. not just for Lakota, but for everyone. By posing a block to capitalist expansion and extraction, Indigenous sovereignty does this. It does, in fact, protect lands and waters. This is one small example, and one from a collective archive that can be called up to demonstrate how sovereignty works and how crucial it is to the lives not only of Indigenous peoples in territories, but also in cases where the lives of their territories, the liveliness of their territories, the subsurface, which then was called subsurface soil, mineral deposits, its resources, but how the lives of those territories affect the health of others. And here again, I say the environment, what some people might call ecology, and the lives that are attached to this sort of atmosphere. When this is centered, when Indigenous sovereignty then is centered, it can benefit all. But I'm mindful here also that there's a political question that lurks below this response, and that it is itself speaking to the question, perhaps, of what is distinct and different than more dominating minority discourses, or what some might call minoritarian, identitarian. Some people say this when they want to dismiss the experiences of others. This is a characterization and a set of identification that I would disagree with. When we speak of treaties and we speak of sovereignty and the specificities that are attached to them, say, for example, from above, the Oglala Lakota or the Ochiti Sakowin, I don't say it properly, or the Haudenosaunee in the Northeast, these are my own people. We are not just calling up an empty signifier. We are calling up a polity, a political order with a land base, with philosophical systems, with languages, with governmental systems. At one time, and still in some parts of these territories, with what appear to be standing armies or warrior societies that also fought in defense of the very water, territory, and lives that are once again imperiled by imperialist aggression under the sign and the desire for extraction or capital accumulation. The shorthand for protecting what is left of these winnowed territories, these aggressed governmentalities and people, sometimes criminalized and supplanted by the state, is sovereignty. So the answer to the question, and this is a prompt that Anna sent us, the question of what is missed when we don't think with sovereignty. What is missed is this fulcrum of political experience as something other than merely distinct. And I think liberal theorists, and we can talk about this now or later, this was like very du jour when I was up in Canada, going to grad school, doing my grad training, was like, these cultural minorities, we were imagined as cultural minorities. Distinct cultural minorities, and then the project legally is to prove how distinct you are, which is very difficult to do. Although for some rather than others, but it's a cunning game, as my colleague Elizabeth Pavanelli has written. Sometimes other than distinct, or what does a language of distinct miss? It misses the ethical, geographic, and political possibility of reimagining and reauthorizing place in light of these existing political orders, their relationship and their stewardship to territories, and not only that, the deep ethical and heuristic challenge of reframing these so-called multicultural democracies as settler states. And I think this is the political work that are new, that sit on land that has been violently expropriated, that, as Anna mentioned in her land acknowledgement, has somehow been rendered property that we all have a relationship to as owners or as tenants, and that has built an economy with an alienated labor base and is now imagining itself as new. So what happens to our collective sense of self and our relationship to place when we think about where we are in those terms. When we think of ourselves as sitting atop antiquities, you know, that there actually is history in this place that's extraordinarily deep. Alongside of and within people who have survived these storms, whether these be the storms of enslavement or the storms of dispossession, the double helix of these dispossessions, and atop these violences. When we think solely in terms of racialization, we miss key empirical, philosophical, and ethical points, incontrovertible points. Indigenous peoples here were and are polities that entered into international agreements of peace and friendship with other nations in the process of a massive land grab, a land grab that I've argued is still going on, other people have argued it's still going on, one which was resisted and is still at times resisted militarily. These are polities that were then racialized in an American geopolitical and biopolitical project of settling, and an ongoing project of dispossessing, containing, and disappearing or absorbing indigeneity via assimilation. But this is like a bracketing and an abbreviation of a history that is much more complicated than this, via assimilation. But this has been resisted very steadfastly and in different ways all over North America. So none of this is in any way settled. Assertions of sovereignty are one symptom of that unsettledness. So this is a claim, and this is, I would say, an analytic that fundamentally challenges the category and the framing of peoplehood as minoritized and therefore also insignificant. It troubles claims of ownership, and it troubles an easy and just governance by a still settling state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, very dense. I tried to take a lot of notes. I would love to hand it over to my Sialuk Jacobsen now. Please introduce yourself and your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I am from Kirstine, North Greenland, and I currently live in Svendborg in Denmark and is as such a Greenlander in Denmark. I am, as Elizabeth was saying, a traditional Inuit tattoo artist and a private researcher in Inuit's intangible culture and religion. I do lectures and I disseminate as often as I can, and I have 20 years of experience in the tattoo profession. So since 2010, where I founded the Tattoo and Research Project, Inuit Tattoo Traditions, I have worked with all the Inuit territories, which means Greenland, Canada, and Alaska. I have not had the chance to go to Russia, and I don't think that's going to happen right now. I have worked in Alaska with bringing back pattern understanding and tattoo methods, and I taught 4 women there from 3 Inupiat tribes and the Yupik tribe. I have worked in Greenland too, with teaching and disseminating and doing research. The research and the working on the cultural preservation takes much of my time, much more than tattooing does, yet I am still tattooing Inuit several times a week, and one could maybe talk about mass production as we are more tattooers on the Inuit territories, and we have combined tattooed more Inuit now than lived on our lands back when the practice was still a part of everyday life. I work together with both museums and universities, although I am a citizen scientist and I work, I also collaborate with more tattoo scholars, and I learn a lot from them, and I hopefully can also teach them a few things. I've been trying to raise awareness on hygiene and security within Indigenous tattooing on the North American continent, where I would say more than 90%, if not more, actually, of the tattooers are more or less self-taught, and our peoples live in areas where there is little to no medical aid to get, and high numbers of things like hepatitis, and bringing back culture should be positive, and we just have to acknowledge the fact that it can have a negative downside. And to avoid that negative downside, we have to work with the people that have settled on our lands, and follow their rules and use their medical knowledge. And that is something we struggle with a little bit. I also have been participating in dialogues with the authorities here in Denmark regarding legislation on tattooing and the freedom to show cultural affiliation in Denmark, where facial tattoos and hand tattoos are prohibited by law. I have met with the health committee in our government here in Denmark on various occasions and presented the request for an exception for Inuit in Denmark, and have not been successful. We're still not allowed. My work, I would like to talk a little bit about the process and the challenges of decolonizing the Greenlandic mindset through Inuit tattooing and my perspectives as a researcher and a practitioner. It's a research and a reintroduction of immaterial culture, and as I said, my work covers all the Inuit territories, and I've had the chance to work both in Greenland/Denmark as well as in Alaska, and I've been doing some minor work in Canada as well with various Inuit peoples. We are small people in number, but we cover vast landmass, and that obviously has some political impacts when we talk about, for instance, natural resources and such. We don't ourselves, I believe, have people enough to use the natural resources, but that's another discussion. Inuit territories cover halfway around the Earth circumpolar. And we share both languages, material and immaterial cultural heritage, and we have all been colonized and have thus been divided into citizens of 4 nations. We are now Russians or Americans or Canadians or Danes. In Denmark, where I live now, resides the 3rd largest group of Inuit in diaspora. We do not currently have minority status here. So we are simply Danes, yet obviously we're not. My work to try and navigate in those mechanisms of being a minority but not having minority status, all those subtle subtle mechanisms that are at hand when we are talking of the communication between the Danes and the Greenlanders. I simply work from the ground up, woman by woman. Our tattoo practice is female, and it is women tattooing women. And I go on a very personal level. Each individual specific homeland traditions in Greenland or other Inuit territories, and the degree of cultural anchoring is taken into account in preparation for applying tattooing. I believe the value of the tattooing itself is intimately tied to the implementation of cultural knowledge, because it is through the intangible aspects of culture that we do find the essence of being Inuk, despite living in a Western community or in a more and more Westernized community back home. The act of rediscovery of thought and understanding can be a valuable tool in the process of healing these identity issues and other post-colonial wounds. The crucial function of cultural heritage to the healing process that Kuokkanen Inuit tattooing can contribute to is, however, threatened and fragilized by the ongoing culture loss that Galasik Greenlanders and other Inuit are suffering from. Unethical practices, both from within and without the Inuit community, contribute to the harmful process of cultural erosion. On one hand, highly visible Western academics who have only superficial and often wrong understanding of Inuit tattooing, they interfere and they weaken and deform cultural heritage by positioning themselves as credible sources of ancestral knowledge. While on the other, Inuit, which is the Inuit way, is eroded by Inuit practitioners themselves when they partake in the commodification of Inuit Kuokkanen. The culturally impoverishing practice is a legacy of the colonial interdiction of Kuokkanen, which erased not only the practice, but the social norms which shaped and guided it. So we stand now without social norms and have to reinvent them surrounding the re-implementation of the tattoos. And this is a very confusing time regarding that. I aim to contribute to the conversation on cultural revival and cultural reintroduction and cultural repair by disseminating my research in both immaterial culture as well as colonial and post-colonial mechanisms in a language that penetrates the walls of the ivory tower that is Western academia. We sorely need language to address both the academic tradition that is rooted in the Eurocratic and Christian mindset, as well as achieving a level of vocabulary on these painful subjects so that we also dare to look inward with a critical view on how we handle taking back culture. We have learned from the Western mindset to use culture as a resource instead of a source, to use nature as a resource instead of a source. It is a way to be successful in a globalized existence, but it goes against our original worldview that still lives in us and thus adds to the post-colonial pain. My work is often regarded as political activism. Personally, I reject that. My work is highly connected to my own personal life and the very personal existence of others. My work is not directly about changing the system, although I find it crucial to stop systemic racism and systemic inequality in the realm of Denmark. My work is about repairing and giving strength to the individual by giving them insight to their cultural heritage and knowledge of who we Inuit are. I believe in the strength of cultural anchorage. A tree with strong roots does not fall in the storm. And the storm being the constant subtle racism on a personal level that we as Greenlandic Inuit encounter by a Danish population that has little to no insight to neither the colonial history nor the feelings and the experience of the inequality. The life of the Danes and the Greenlanders is very disconnected as it is now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over the mic to Professor Rauna Kuokkanen. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth, also for your generous introduction. Upon my return home, or nearly home, my home, as Elizabeth mentioned, is in Ohtsiohka. I'm a bit further south from there at the moment. From nearly 2 decades in Canada, it's been really interesting as a Sámi and Indigenous scholar to focus my research on settler colonialism in the Nordics. There is a long history, as others have brought it up earlier, of a history of denying the existence of colonialism in Scandinavia. The benign welfare states and the peace brokers of the international community have been frequently considered somehow outside the colonial history and present. Finland in particular, where I'm currently based, has used narratives of being colonized first by Sweden and later Russia to deny its involvement in colonialism. There are prevailing common misconceptions of colonialism, which include, for example, that colonialism is, or mostly is, about the past, and thus we can only talk about coloniality or legacies of colonialism, or that colonialism is about colonies, and or that the concept of colonialism is confusing, difficult, or too broad to have analytical value. All of these views are frequently applied both in general terms and in scholarship, in public discourse, and specifically with regard to the Sámi people. In the past several years, however, this has changed considerably toward a more open and honest examination by a range of Scandinavian scholars. Increasingly in the past couple of years, settler colonial analytic has also gained ground, which is quite exciting. Like there has been a longer engagement with colonialism, but the past couple of years with settler colonial theory as well. In my own research, I have examined particularly the settler colonial present in the Nordics. And in my couple of minutes, I summarize my main arguments. First, I have employed settler colonial theory to consider the 2017 Tätnu River fishing agreement between Norway and Finland, and to argue, I don't have time to go into the detail what the agreement is, but what I argue is that by imposing new restrictions on the traditional Sámi salmon fisheries, which this most recent iteration did, the agreement erects a new wall in addition to the existing boundary in the middle of the river. It is the border. The river is the border between Norway and Finland for most of the river. So this it erects a new wall as an effort to reinforce a state authority. More specifically, I suggest that since their first iteration in the late 1800s, these Tätnu agreements represent the policy framework employed as a tool of settler colonial domestication. They have served as a means of affirming state sovereignty in the region and erasing the remaining Sámi practices of governance and stewardship of the river and its fisheries. Through domestication, the Sámi have been made into objects of settler policy and control, and consequently their sovereignty has been denied. If access to territory is the primary motive of settler colonialism, preventing access to that territory from the indigenous others is co-constitutive of that objective. This does not necessarily involve physical removal, as Lorenzo Veracini demonstrates in his analysis of a range of settler colonial strategies of replacement and dispossession. He calls these strategies as transfers, some of which overlap and are concurrent, while others are mutually exclusive. Two types of transfers are most prominently at play in the 2017 Dayton agreements. Transfer by coerced lifestyle change, which takes place when, and I quote, indigenous way of life and social and political organization are uprooted and obliterated, and administrative transfer, which occurs when the administrative borders of the settler polity are withdrawn and indigenous people lose entitlements they have retained in the context of previous arrangements. So I suggest that these two transfers seek to prevent local Sámi accessing their river, where they have been fishing for salmon for thousands of years, and the concomitant system of knowledge, skills, and culture. Second, I have examined the truth and reconciliation process in Finland through the lens of settler colonial analysis. I've argued that reconciliation, although seemingly progressive, and I say progressive because the Finnish TRC process, the mandate of the Commission also includes attention to structural colonialism and injustice. I, however, argue that it signifies a continuation of colonialism, considering the state's ongoing approach to overlooking Sámi rights on multiple fronts. What is particularly striking is the way in which Finnish state has, in the past few years, repeatedly disregarded its own basic legislative obligations toward the Sámi. The Sámi people's right to their culture and language is constitutionally protected in Finland. State authorities are also required to consult the Sámi parliament on measures with significant impact on the status of the Sámi as an indigenous people. This basic requirement has been frequently breached in several legislative and policy initiatives, such as failing to incorporate sections in legislation involving so-called state lands that would have improved the protections to Sámi livelihoods and land use. The already mentioned Dayton agreement, by not adequately involving the local Sámi rights holders in the negotiations in an adequate manner, failing to consult the Sámi parliament or reindeer herding cooperatives with regard to the now cancelled bilateral initiative to build a railway through the Sámi territory to the Arctic Ocean. I argue that looking at Finland's tacit Sámi policy and its explicit legislative action in the past decade, it's not difficult to view state engagement in truth and reconciliation process as part of the continuum in the settler colonial logic of elimination. There's a blurred line between inclusion and exclusion, yet both are powerful colonizing practices. Inclusion, not to be mistaken either for indigenous decolonization or for self-determination, is an effective mechanism of indigenous domestication, and policymaking is one of its key sites. Policymaking continues to serve as a settler colonial strategy in contemporary settings as a way of asserting settler sovereignty and jurisdiction. Third, I have considered the question of colonialism vis-a-vis the Sámi and the way in which it is commonly framed in terms of internal colonialism, and thus assumed and presented, if it's discussed at all, as distinct from other colonial and colonization processes. The idea of internal colonialism has been criticized for reasons similar to diversity and multiculturalism approaches that culturalize indigenous peoples. Internal colonialism theory overlooks the historical and present-day reality of indigenous peoples as distinct peoples or nations with a right to self-determination, what Audra was talking about. and reduces them as a single ethnic, racial, or cultural minority within the national borders. It portrays the states as multicultural nations that need to address only their legacies of racism, not their colonial histories and the colonial presence built in the structures and policies of the state. Through these structures and policies, Indigenous peoples are constructed as minorities with no prior claim to nation or territory, just as Audra was talking about, that would transcend the state's existence, right claims, or unilateral imposition of sovereignty. And fourth, and finally, I have recently finished an article on green colonialism, asking the question if reindeer is the new buffalo. So in it, I examine climate change, the green shift, and the narratives of manifest destiny in Sámi. And I look at the Green Deal policies, particularly the EU, but also the national ones. And I demonstrate how settler colonialism is not only a structure of perpetual disappearance of Indigenous bodies, but also of perpetual disappearance of key sources of Indigenous sustenance. And I suggest that in the same way, the destruction of buffalo was a deliberate approach, an effort to force Native Americans to the reservation system. Reindeer is now being sacrificed in the race to the carbon neutral society, particularly through the massive, extensive building of wind industry in the key reindeer grazing regions in particularly northern parts of Norway and Sweden, but it's coming to Finland as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, and I'll just quickly hand it over to Professor Ellen Marie Jensen.
Hey, I don't see anybody, so I don't know if you can hear me. It's kind of strange talking into the void. Okay. I'm not a professor, I should say. I'm an associate professor. I have not come that far in my career. So yeah, I will just start by saying thank you for the opportunity to everybody who has been part of bringing me here to be a part of this critically important discussion today. And the theoretical framework that the organizers have laid out has enabled me to better conceptualize my own future research, and especially from within a coastal Sámi framework. And as you heard from my bio, much of my research has been on transatlantic Sámi migration from an Indigenous and gendered perspective. And today I'm going to speak to the experiences of transatlantic migration, but rather than focus on migration of other Sámi women in the early 20th century to North America, I'm going to focus attention on an important man from the early 20th century from my own migration. That is my own contemporary migration from North America back to my Sámi home here in Sápmi. And I should probably clarify that I am coming to you from Kuokkanen, from Kirstine, but this is not my own community. My own community is on the coast, which you'll be hearing more about, but I live in this community. So this man is my great-grandfather, or one of my great-grandfathers, Moderator Aslak, or Aslak Jensen, from Lakovonia, or Langfjord. This is in the west coastal area of Finnmark province, close to the Altafjord, or actually it's an offshoot of it's a side fjord of the Altafjord. And from here on, I will just refer to him as Moderator, or my Moderator. So let me begin with a quote from the conference program, which is, "The intersection of the law, race, capital, and the state." And I'm going to speak to the specific ways in which each element of this intersection played out in settler colonialism in my Moderator's life in his fjord on the west coast of Finnmark province. I will begin with the law and Moderator's legal last name. During the earlier colonial policy of Norwegianization, and I make that temporal reference because we can say that Norwegianization is ongoing, even if the policy officially ended. We are still enduring in Norwegianization. There was a law that was enacted whereby Sámi people would not be given title to their own land unless they had a Norwegian name. And to the best of our knowledge, Sámi people on the coastal communities of West Finnmark did not have the clan names oftentimes associated with Sámi people from the inland reindeer herding communities. Like other Sámi people in Sápmi, we, the people of West Coast of Finnmark, were named for our relations, to whom we belonged, and in relation to our place. So this also explains my very Danish sounding name. Those of you who are connected to Denmark would likely recognize I have a very Danish sounding name. I am not even remotely Danish. This also came from Norwegianization from my other Moderator, my other great grandfather from the neighboring fjord. So our names are not only legally imposed by the colonial law of the colonial state, they're also patriarchal. Race. Many Sámi people would not speak of race as if we are a specific race or as if distinct races actually exist, but we are targets of racism. I have been the target of racism. I have been the target of the softly violent form of racism, that death by a million paper cuts kind of racism. And I've also been targeted with more frightening, breathtaking, direct in your face racism. And that has happened right here in Finnmark province on our land. But race as conceptualized by the Swedish eugenicists who studied the Sámi, who robbed our graves, measured our skulls, and photographed us in humiliating poses, was also later taken up by Hitler. My own family lives with the bone-chilling reality that the Sámi were on the list of Hitler's undesirable races. In 1944, after living under Nazi occupation for nearly 4 years, the Nazis enacted the scorched earth policy. The population of Finnmark and the northern part of Troms province were given deportation orders. They were rounded up onto boats and forced into refugee status in southern communities in Norway. And everything was burned to the ground, including much of our coastal Sámi material culture. Moderator, by this time an elder, resisted the order, and like many other Sámi people with knowledge of the land and how to live on the land, he hid out in his boatti, or his traditional turf hut, along with his young family. And when a Norwegian Nazi collaborator caught wind of their whereabouts, he ratted them out to the local Nazi brigade. And I can just hear it. Those Laps are hiding up there in the mountains. And of course, Laps is a racist derogatory term for the Sámi, which was used very much, it was used every day in this time. So Moderator's sons, my uncles, or rather 2 of my grandfathers, of many grandfathers in the Sámi relational framework, they were sent to the concentration camp in Oslo called Grini. The women, children, and elders were sent to a community in southern Norway where they were required to live with an ethnically Norwegian family. And the story I have heard is that this Norwegian family was terrified of those strange people coming from the north. Of course, there's some racial implications there. And the father of the family said something to this effect, "Don't be afraid, they are pretty people, but they all have brown eyes." Capital. For reasons unknown to us, Moderator moved from his family's traditional areas of settlement to the lower end of the fjord in the 19th century. But what we do know is that mining and other forms of extraction were and are critical to the dispossession of the Sámi. In 1826, a copper mine was established in proximity of my Moderator's home. This brought an influx of Norwegian settlers to the area. And this undoubtedly also put pressure on the coastal Sámi communities living in the fjord. The Norwegian settlers were given special privileges. They were, after all, de facto representatives of the colonial state. But colonial development and the destruction of the land and waters that it wrought did not end when the copper mine closed for good in 1909. Coastal Sámi communities have been under greater and greater pressure to give up their traditional livelihoods and become part of the industrialized capitalist economy. After the burning of Finnmark by the Nazis, Moderator and his family returned to their home, to their fjord and their land, which they did in defiance of the pressure to simply give it all up and stay in the south. My uncles survived and returned from the concentration camp, and while emaciated and exhausted, they were ready to return to their home and way of life as small-scale fjord fishers and farmers. But with the end of the war came even greater industrialization, greater capitalist interests, and greater pressure to become good Norwegians in a very nationalist framework. Today, our fjord has been inundated with fish farms, and the very entry point to the valley where Moderator and his family used to winter is now a quarry, the site of industrial colonial extraction. And today, none of Moderator's direct descendants are fishers or farmers in our fjord, in our Sámi home. The state, like his coastal Sámi contemporaries Isak Saba and Anders Larsen, in 1910, Moderator decided to engage directly in the colonial systems of the state. Perhaps he believed that he could affect change, and he was known to be a religious leader and a strong-willed person. So he ran for the municipal council, and he won, and today he is listed as a Sámi representative in the archives. But he was only one of 3 representatives on the council of 12 men. The other 9 men were Norwegian. But another colonial process at this very same time was unfolding, which was the Norwegian census taking, which was remarkably thorough in either a very othering lens or total erasure. Where 10 years earlier, Moderator had been listed as a Lap who spoke Lappish in the sense when the census taker came. But then in 1910, he was listed as a Norwegian and as a Norwegian speaker. In other words, we were even Norwegianized and erased in the colonial record. Now, of course, we do not know the story of what happened in that exchange between the census taker and Moderator, that exchange, but we do know that it was entirely the purview of the state to define what he was and who he was. That Norwegian state has the power to define today. They have the power to impose. They have the power to extract or allow for extraction on our lands. This is all the purview of the state. So as I move forward in my research plans that address the particular conditions of settler colonialism in the fjord communities of West Finnmark, I will bring this conceptual framework with me. The law, race, capital, and the state. But further in my future research, I will open up for the voices of my people from the coastal communities, my people who have endured the extended policy of Norwegianization. I will open up spaces for the voices of my people who continue to exclaim that we are here and we are thriving despite the ongoing erasure of the state, the colonial state. Thank you for your attention. Olugito.
Thank you so much, all of you. This was quite wonderful and dense. Oh, and I will speak up. You panelists are invited to put your cameras on, and the audience, you're welcome to send questions in the Q&A. I will begin with the first question, and then we'll see what we'll be taking in. So in the preparation for this, we asked what questions you might have. And so I'm going to ask a question that's based on a question that you, Ellen Marie Jensen, which I pronounce very Danish, that you post, and I'll ground it in that and add a little bit. So something that all of you have mentioned is assimilation, or domestication, or inclusion into a national framework as actually a violent act. And the question, or the sort of paradox that Ellen Marie Jensen brought up, was this: on the one hand, what indigenous assimilation means and incorporation into a nation state, what that means in relationship to migrant or immigrant minority discourses that sometimes center nationality as the way to obtain equality or belonging in this new place. And so what you also said was, this is not a dichotomy, and there's a lot of spaces to exist in between. I would say there's a lot of experience of being born into assimilation as a default, for example, second, third, fourth immigrant experiences, right? Who do not wish that citizenship, but also cannot go back in any sensible way to another place, right? So this is a real tension, and I wonder how you think about this, how we think about this sort of across these two topics of the two panels, where the other panel think more about racialization, right? But maybe with another notion of land or nationhood and so on. And so these types of forced assimilation and assimilation as the solution, what do we do about that in broader conversations about freedom and free futures across different relationships of power and oppression? So actually, anyone who wants to begin are welcome to do so.
I can begin if you like. Yeah, it makes me think about something that I'm talking about a lot with my clients, that they are part of what we could call a third culture, in between the two cultures, that they are Greenlanders in Denmark, and Greenlanders in Denmark are not Danish, but they're not necessarily Greenlandic either, as how life is lived on the daily. The problem is that the third culture is not acknowledged, it is not described, and it is not empowered. It just is, and it seems to be a very lonely experience for each individual, like they are not realizing that they are the same as everybody else in the third culture. So I think a big step would be to acknowledge the third culture, and I don't know if it needs a name necessarily, but it would help, now that everybody are talking about pronouns and whatnot. It's maybe nice to even have a name for it, something to call it, instead of just Greenlanders in Denmark. And because a lot of the Greenlanders here are born here or have lived here since they were quite young, but even people who have been here for a shorter time, I see how the stronger culture is taking over very, very quickly. And when you combine that with the learned experience of feeling a little bit ashamed of the traditional culture, because it has always been belittled, then it's very easy to take on the Danish identity and live not integrated but assimilated, because it's easier. But you can't do that without, it has a price, and that price is very personal and very painful. So I think the answer lies within accepting the third culture.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to speak to this? All right. Well, I would, yeah, I appreciate this notion of third culture that you bring up. It's something that's familiar also in the work that I do, and I think it's interesting to think about how the lack of a recognition of racism as such in this context, how that when internalized, makes the experience very lonely, because thinking in terms of group or collective identity, or just a collective experience, let me put it like that, becomes a taboo when the premise for equality we learn is sort of sameness. So pointing out your own experience as something that's actually shared with others seems like it's almost cognitively not a possibility. So I do wonder how that plays in there also. Okay, I'm going to look at the questions here. So we have a question in the Q&A from Connie Amundsen, who says, can anyone speak to urban homelessness in the Nordic countries in relation to the colonized mind?
Oh.
Oh, also, if Ellen, you had something to add to the previous conversation, please go ahead. I didn't see the chat.
Oh, I wanted to give other people an opportunity to speak to that because I don't actually have a concrete answer, but it arises from, or that question, or that sort of contemplation arises from my experience of seeing, well, I guess from being a sort of returning Sámi and having to go through the process of learning Norwegian, taking Norwegian courses through a very nationalistic framework. And it's like highly nationalistic. I'm shocked at how ingrained it is in everyday life and in everyday people's way of being. It's very framed by a Norwegian nationalist framework. And much like Rauna talked about, the same kind of discourse is here, that the idea that Norway was colonized by Denmark and was in union with Sweden, right? We experienced that too. So the context, the Norwegian Sámi context and the Finnish Sámi context share very much in that sense of like that narrative of like, how do you even talk about colonization of the Sámi? And, you know, we were all screwed over by these big superpowers. So I think one of the problems that we have is that we do kind of lack a way of helping people understand what is indigeneity and what does it mean for us, because this is a very different thing when, again, you know, we lived beside our colonizers before. I mean, in the Norwegian context, I don't want to speak to the Finnish Sámi context, but in the Norwegian Sámi and Swedish Sámi context, I would say that a sort of like temporal moment where everything changed was when Saint Olaf, the king, stopped being a Norse, like a Viking, right, who followed that tradition and became a Christian. So, you know, we've been under Christian domination for a very long time. So, you know, how do you get people to understand indigeneity, and that is a very distinct category, and it's very different from being a minority in the Nordic context, because we have national minorities. I know Finland has national minorities, and we have national minorities in Norway, but we are often put into that category. And we live something very different than that, because many people with migrant or immigrant backgrounds, Norwegians of color, or Norwegians that have immigrant background, that's kind of the language that's used, oftentimes want to be considered Norwegian. And this is the greatest tension, I think, is that some people want to be considered Norwegian and we don't, right? There's this like tension there, like to say, you know, and this is very provocative for Norwegians when I say, I'm not Norwegian. I don't feel Norwegian at all. My mother's American. My father is a Sámi. I didn't grow up in Norway. I came here to Sápmi, and I don't have a sense of being Norwegian. And this is very provocative for people. So I think there's that great tension there where, you know, people don't understand that frustration that arises when your people have been forcibly assimilated for almost 1,000 years when you think about it. So it's a different condition altogether. So I think that's an important conversation, and this is the beginning. I don't have an answer. I just think that we lack the framework in Nordic languages and in Sámi to describe this tension. That's, yeah.
I would just like to say something about the question on homelessness that you brought up, because in Denmark we have a group of homeless people from Greenland, and I find it very interesting how they end there. How do they end in such a situation? There are homeless people in Greenland as well, not as many, obviously, and one could say that it is easier to be homeless in Denmark, where the winter is 7 degrees plus rather than -20. But my experience here in Denmark is that the Danish experience of the Greenlandic homelessness is not about system. It's not systemic, but it's about character. So the Greenlandic homeless or the Greenlandic drunk in the street becomes the person that the Danish people know as Greenlander. And it is in his or her character that it's wrong. It's not a systemic failure. And that's something we struggle very much with to alter this view on humans, where homelessness is something that happens because you are of a certain people, and then that's just how you are, rather than we as a people. I'm trying to speak as a Danish person now, like we as Danish people have a narrative about our country as being like green and amazing, and windmills and Hans Christian Andersen and organic food. And then we have this group of people that are kind of, an eyesore in that narrative, and that must be because they cannot adapt to the prettiness of this country, and that's maybe something that is lacking in the education of the white people, that they learn that we are all equal, and this old way of seeing races in a hierarchy, it's not how we do things anymore, and maybe they should take a look inward and look at the system.
Thank you so much. I wonder if you would like to also contextualize the different reasons for Greenlanders in Denmark, because not everybody came by their own will. And so actually also a systemic reason for neglect, right? And I'm thinking about removal of children.
Yeah.
A collective experience.
Yeah, it's not quite like the 60s scoop in Canada, but it's not quite unlike it either. Very many children was taken to Denmark, and it's getting more and more attention right now these days. There's been a lot of attention on a specific, should we call it a project or experiment, where they took 22 children from Greenland and placed them in Danish homes in the 50s. And these children, some never made it home again. Others made it back home to Greenland, but there was like an agreement between the Red Cross and the government that the children could not be put into a situation that was not the same level, the same standard as the Danish standard that they came from when they returned from Denmark. So they could not go back to living with their parents, but were put in orphanages, sometimes in the same town where the parents were living. So these children were like the beginning of a time where children were sent to Denmark and growing up. The art that you see behind me is actually precisely on this matter, and I had it exhibited in Copenhagen for several months. It just came back home because after the 22 children, which were the only ones getting attention for this, hundreds of children were taken by Danish sent to Greenland. These children were not necessarily Greenland. Some were poor, but 80s. I was sent to Denmark in 1980 for months to stay with the Danish family. My whole, the entire class, my whole school was sent, like when we were in, I think the 3rd or the 4th grade. I was 9 years old. And so this is, there was a big, there was this big idea of if we could speak Danish and think Danish, and we would be prepared to study and go back home to Greenland and be like the arrowhead of the new Greenland that would be sized, globalized, and no one ever thought that when you do that to people, they do not become arrowheads of a new civilization. They become quite, you cannot just replant children in a different continent and take their language from them, their culture, their food, their family, everything. So a lot of people ended here that way, but nowadays that is not the case. What happens now is that people are looking for an easier life, and there is a lack of information, lack of preparation on how to go to Denmark. A lot of people come here without being prepared for the Danish system, after all, being so much more complicated than the Greenlandic. We are only 56,000 people in Greenland. So when you come to a country small as it is, with only like 6 million people, it is still very complex. And a lot of people end outside the society. It can also be people who go here to go to school or seeking education, and they fail because it's too hard to be away from home, and it's just it's impossible for them to go back home again for various reasons. And hospitalization is another thing. When you have certain illnesses in Greenland, they have to be treated in Denmark. Sometimes you have to stay here because you can't go back home. You don't have the same system in Greenland to take care of such a normal thing, dialysis, for instance. We have people in Denmark that have to stay here because they need dialysis, you know. Also, just lastly, I would like to point out the problems, the issue of young people leaving Greenland for Denmark to attend university or other educations. They start families here, and there are no there's no education for their children in the Greenlandic language, again because we do not have minority status. We don't have the right to these things, and so their children become very Danish and will have a hard time following school. Also, the young people get accustomed to the level of easiness of living here comparing to the harder life and less possibilities back home. So a lot of people with high education, they actually stay away, and Greenland sorely needs them to come home, but nothing is being done to make it easier to go back home as of yet, you know.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have something to add to this? All right, in that case, I would like to combine two questions, one from Monica Miller and one from the Q&A from Inez Duong-Pitika. So the first question, maybe you want to take notes since there's two. The first question is this. So it's on solidarities. If minoritization puts pressure on potential coalition between Indigenous people and other racial minorities or immigrant groups in the Nordics by erasing sovereignty, how can we think about an orientation, or what orientation can we use to think about coalition? I'm thinking about other frames of quote-unquote inclusion that might not be nation or state-based, if that is possible. So that was the question from Monica Miller. And then I want to read this other question alongside it. Are you aware in your own specific context of political coalitions between Indigenous people struggle for sovereignty and liberation struggles of Black and people of color against white supremacy, or refugee struggles against border imperialism? Do these political coalitions exist? If so, what do you think? What do they look like? And if not, why do you think that may be the case?
I can start. Thank you for those questions. I wrote that phrase down, non-state frames of inclusion. I think it's something that certainly needs more thinking and theorizing and, well, collaborative thinking in the Nordic context. And I think there are some emergent forms that are coming together. There's certainly perhaps one of the upsides of the TRC process is now ongoing in Sweden, Norway, and Finland is a greater interest. Like there has been greater media attention to Sámi issues, and as the result of the TRC processes at various stages in the three countries. And so there is also considerably greater interest among various groups towards Sámi, but these are only like early stages. Like I receive various requests to speak to refugees and mixed race people in Finland about the Sámi, and they're certainly interested in colonization. Like there is this kind of basic understanding of the kind of colonial framework. So you don't necessarily have to start from the square one, or when you start talking about these issues, which is often the case in the Nordic context, that we kind of limit our conversation to culture and identity, which I consider one of the greatest problems in talking about indigeneity in the Nordic context and the indigeneity of the Sámi people, that we only see, as I mentioned in my brief remarks, that the kind of culturalization of Sámi in particular, which I pointed out in many occasions that the Sámi themselves are sometimes guilty of, that we have sort of been, we have to some of us have internalized this mindset that we are only a culture and an identity, because the history of colonization goes back hundreds of years, and there aren't necessarily they're like, for instance, the traditional Sámi governance structures are operational in reindeer herding, and the Skolt Sámi, like in a modified version, with the Skolt Sámi, in the eastern parts of Finland and mostly. So, but other than that, there aren't kind of living governance structures practiced today to an extent to compared to many other indigenous communities. So there's this idea that Sámi are only a culture, and it also it's evident and it's perpetuated by legislation, like particularly in Finland, the Sámi are recognized as an indigenous people in the constitution, but the law that recognizes, or the legislation that recognizes the Sámi autonomy is only limited to cultural autonomy. So it's sort of like it doesn't go far enough to recognize the Sámi as a political entity, as a nation, as a people. Like it doesn't grant creator rights that are recognized to linguistic or cultural minorities. But I think the frame, going back to this idea of non-state frames of inclusion, I think it's around social justice. Various forms of social justice frameworks that are emerging, like in the summer 2020, there's Black Lives Matter, was very active, was taken up by Sámi activists and many Sámi people, and it has to, and it has been taking place both, or like kind of learning on both sides, because there is racism also in the Sámi community. That those kind of racism, anti-Black racism, has to be addressed also in the Sámi community. So it's sort of like coming together, finding a common ground where these issues we can learn from one another, and be open to also challenge our own blind spots and misunderstandings and prejudices, and and willing to challenge those. But it's in very early stages. But there's some. I remain optimistic, but compared to North America, where I lived for many years, it's really a nascent field. But it's exciting to see that it's popping up in various ways and locations.
I can, Elizabeth, I'm mindful of the Nordic emphasis here, so I'm trying to not speak as much, but I do feel I should answer some of these questions about organizing. There's a long history, I mean, as long as histories go in settler colonial nation states, but there is a history of Indigenous Black solidarities and organizing that's both domestic and also global. Our colleague at University of British Columbia, the Dene political theorist, Glenn Couthard, is writing a book on these solidarities and this organizing across Canada and into Tanzania in the 1970s, looking at George Manuel and his collaborators or interlocutors in Tanzania, bringing these ideas of liberation back to Indigenous territories, moving them through organizing there. And you can see that in the two books that have been reissued on Manuel fairly recently after his passing. You can see this in Lee Marichel's first work. She was on the ground organizing also in the histories of the Black Panthers and the American Indian movement in various cities. So these are histories that aren't at the forefront as moments of collaboration, of inspiration, and also distinction. I mean, in the organizing in Minneapolis, so interesting, you know, the American Indian movement starts in Minneapolis. George Floyd is killed in Minneapolis. The American Indian movement started because of violence against Indigenous peoples in the city at the hands of the police. So there are these interlocking, very familiar histories in these cities. And I think that's, you know, both discoverable in text and also the texts are being written. These histories have also been siloed. Harsha, on the question of anti-Asian like the sort of migrant, the violence against folks at borders. Harsha Walia, who's an organizer and a legal scholar of sorts in the Pacific Northwest, located in Vancouver, has written a book against border imperialism that really centers Indigenous sovereignty in organizing against border violence for migrants. So I think that is in some ways perhaps the model, but the models, I don't want to make it seem exceptional. I think this is stuff that people are doing on the ground. I'd like to also remind folks that at Nordic, Black Lives Matter showed up in the camps. That Indigenous, in my community of Ganawage, we had Black Lives Matter protests in the community when George Floyd was killed by the police, was murdered by the police. So this is happening, right? It's just indecipherable to some, or it doesn't get registered, or it's in a Twitter feed, or but these are part of people's lives also, as well. If we're looking for, again, I don't want to exceptionalize certain models of political organizing, but Red Nation, based in Albuquerque, is looking at the intersection of, violence against Black folks, violence against Palestinians, violence against Indigenous peoples, and the ways in which this all interlocks in certain imperial grammars that must be resisted on the ground. And that is what their organizing is about. So those are some examples that I can give, but I don't want to exceptionalize them as only examples and to dehistoricize them as something that is without a context in this country. I think these folks are imagined as entirely separate from each other, and this is set up as an antagonism, and there are particular bodies of thought, scholarly thoughts, we don't have to invoke them right now, that also, traffic in that a supposed antagonism between these communities, and actually, anyway, we don't have to get into that, but I think this is, these are actual histories that existed and inform politics of the present and inform organizing between folks.
Does anyone want to add to that?
Yeah. I think, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, it's very tempting for me to be really comparative now because I grew up in Minneapolis. So, and I'm very used to seeing that sort of coalition that you're referring to, Audra. And I've been a part of that myself, actually, in my earlier life before I returned to Sámi. And I still can't quite figure out what it is that, I mean, you talk about an antagonism and that maybe we should look beyond that. But unfortunately, I think it's really hard for a lot of people, as Rauna talked about, to see us as a political entity, that we actually have, that we live indigeneity here on our land, and that acknowledgement is so often not given, and so often a lot of whataboutism can be played in the sense of, like, we live in a welfare state and we are considered to be equal. Everybody has the equal access to all these benefits and all these wonderful things. And it's very easy for people to say, what are you complaining about? What do you want? You're just like them. You're just like the Norwegians. You're just like the Finns, right? So there's this kind of, and I say that because I have seen that happen, and it's really been hard for me personally to address. I generally try not to address it because obviously when I speak English in these contexts, people know right away that I'm also American. So it's a different thing if it comes from Rauna or from somebody who actually grew up here. So I think there's this whole question of, we want access to land. We don't have this idea of like that we've been sort of culturized and that it's only about culture. We don't have a culture without our land. Like, our land and our waters give rise to our culture. So I think that's a really big part of some of what might be a tension. And also I have seen really beautiful solidarities and people coming together, in particular around some of the most just profound violence on the part of the Norwegian state here, when children of asylum seekers have been living in a small northern community among local people for as long as they were, maybe they're 2 years old and they've been living there for 11 years, and all of a sudden they're rounded up and sent out of the country because the Norwegian state decides that their parents shouldn't have asylum. I mean, I have seen Sámi children like crying and going to the media over these cases, or local children, you know. So you see this play out, but I think this idea of also this sort of like individualizing, like that the individual is responsible for this and this and that, or an individual is responsible for racism. And it always sort of gets watered down to this idea of also the individual, that the individual has access to the same resources. We all have, you know, healthcare, we all have the same social safety net, but that came at a great cost to the Sámi people, you know, and it's this kind of, this whole assimilationist frame is so ingrained in this Nordic welfare state model that we just, it's really hard to navigate discursively how to build that solidarity or build coalitions when there's this idea that, you know, nothing's really that bad for us, right? Because we're not poor, because we're not, right? Because Indigenous people are supposed to be poor, and, you know, and we look white to people and they think, you know, so there's a lot, I think there's a lot of barriers for us to move ahead, you know, and I'm very like, I try to be very careful how I address that because I'm so familiar with different contexts. So, but I recognize also just that there is sort of, we lack a framework. But also, I would say too that what you said, Audra, about coalitions and Indigenous Black coalitions over time, I can say that that is also something that is recognizable here, that many Sámi activists and some of our people who, you know, have been really important in sort of revitalization or various movements have been very inspired by anti-colonial movements in Africa and anti-colonial movements especially in Africa, and also Martin Luther King. I mean, he's like very inspirational to many Sámi people. So I think that definitely is a part of it, but I don't see it play out quite on the political level or a sort of community-based level in the way that you see in the US, which is always very inspiring for me when I return to Minneapolis. And I see even, you know, descendants of Sámi immigrants, you know, people living in diaspora are also engaged in these movements. And it's always like, oh, this is so great. But then I don't, you know, and I should also just mention one thing too, that I do not live in a big city either, where you have Sámi people living in Oslo, maybe engaging more directly. I'm living in Finnmark, I'm living in a Sámi community, and I was living in Tromsø in a city. But even there, I wasn't really seeing, you know, that much of this. And I would have liked to.
Thank you so much. This is all that we have time for now. So I'm going to, just thank you so much and hand the microphone back to Anna.
Hi, everyone. I made the rookie mistake again. This is always what happens, that just when we have to wrap up, the conversation is starting to get going, and here we are. The good news is that today has been recorded, because I know that I've been taking a lot of notes, but I also will want to listen to a lot of this again. And so I will go back and listen. They'll be posted on the Heyman website within a couple of weeks, hopefully. But I also actually do want to say that in the month, we made a deliberate effort to try and include similar questions on the Wednesday panel that Jasmine Kellicay will be moderating. So, and I hope that some of the conversations that we are leaving now, that they will be a good point of departure for our next conversation, because it was always the idea to try and establish a conversation that moves across these different themes, right? And think about native dispossession and anti-Blackness within the same conjuncture, right? So we are hoping that we can keep this momentum going on Wednesday. So please do come back. Are there any other last comments from either of you all on the panel? Maya Sialuk, Rauna Kuokkanen, Audra, Simpson, and Ella Marie Jensen? I mean, we've had a lot on the table already, and just like, yeah, there are like 30 seconds who want to say something. I get it. Thank you, everyone, very, very much for your time. Thank you for sharing your thoughts within this, the short space that we had today. I know there are questions that we didn't quite reach. Those of you whose questions didn't get answered, again, please do come back, and let's try and circle back to some of those when we meet on Wednesday, same time, same place, from 10 to 12 p.m. US New York time.